Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let us continue with Surah An-Nisaa bihawlillahi wa quwwatih. We are on ayah number 23. قال الله تعالى حرمت عليكم أمهاتكم وبناتكم وأخواتكم وعماتكم وخالاتكم وبنات الأخ وبنات الأخت وأمهاتكم اللاتي أرضعنكم وأخواتكم من الرضاعة وأمهات نسائكم وربائبكم اللاتي في حجوركم من نسائكم اللاتي دخلتم بهن فإن لم تكونوا دخلتم بهن فلا جناح عليكم وحلائل أبنائكم الذين من أصلابكم وأن تجمعوا بين الأختين إلا ما قد سلف إن الله كان غفورا رحيما. You'll remember in the previous ayah, Allah Jalla wa Ala spoke about how you are not allowed to marry those women your fathers have married. So those are one type of women which you're not allowed to marry. This ayah carries on this theme about certain types of women that men are not allowed to marry. So the ayah is directed to men because it talks about women that you're not allowed to marry. He says, Hurrimat, made haram alaykum, for you are your mothers. Now it does not explicitly state that your mothers are haram for marriage, but it is understood and implied. So this includes your mothers, but also your grandmothers and going up in that line. Grandmothers both from the father's side and the mother's side. وَبَنَاتُكُمْ, your daughters. So this includes your daughters and also your granddaughters and going down in that line. وَأَخَوَاتُكُمْ, this is the plural of ukht. Your sisters, so this would be your full sisters, your consanguine sisters, your uterine sisters, it makes no difference. وَعَمَّاتُكُمْ, your amma is the sister of your father, but this also includes the sister of your father's father, and the sister of your father's father's father, and so on, going up in that line. وَخَالَاتِكُمْ, khala is the sister of your mother, but it includes the sister of your mother's mother, and the sister of your mother's mother's mother, and going up in that line. وَبَنَاتُ الْأَخِ, the daughters of your brothers, and it also includes the daughters of your brother's children, and going down in that line. So your brother's great-granddaughters and great-great-granddaughters, and so on. وَبَنَاتُ الْأُخْتِ, and the daughters of your sisters, so that will be your niece again. Same rule. So up till here he has spoken of 7 types of women. These women are related to you by blood. Then we also have certain women who are related to you not by blood but through breastfeeding. And he says, وَأُمَّهَاتُكُمُ اللَّاتِي أَرْضَعْنَكُمْ, your mothers who have breastfed you. So this is not your biological mother, but it is your breastfeeding mother. And this is the woman who has breastfed you 5 full breastfeeding, when you are at an age where you are breastfeeding, meaning most of your nutrients come from breastfeeding. Notice that the word ummahat is the plural of meaning mother. The ha in the plural is a za'idah, is an increase. It is not from the original root letters. And you do get these words sometimes in the Arabic language where the plural has an increase in the root letters. And it says your sisters from breastfeeding. So that would be if a woman breastfed you, and that same woman, who is not your biological mother, breastfed another female who is not your biological sister. So you and that particular female become brothers and sisters through breastfeeding, and you are mahram to each other. So which means you can be in privacy with each other, you can travel out with each other, but you're not allowed to inherit from each other. The financial rights do not apply, but the rights of privacy do apply. Now only 2 types of women are mentioned with respects to breastfeeding, your mother and your sister. In fact, all the previous 7 women which were mentioned through the nasab, through the lineage or blood relations, also apply to breastfeeding relations. So not just your mothers and your sisters, but also your paternal and maternal aunts and your nieces as well, through the breastfeeding relations, are also haram for marriage, as they are treated as your mahram. So for example, you have a breastfeeding sister. That breastfeeding sister of yours has a daughter. That daughter is haram for you in marriage because she is your niece through breastfeeding. Likewise, the woman who breastfed you, she has a sister. That sister is your maternal aunt through breastfeeding, and therefore haram for you to marry. Likewise, your breastfeeding mother may have her mother. So that mother is your grandmother through breastfeeding, and hence haram for you to marry. So the same 7 women through breastfeeding are haram, just as the nasab. Then he talks about in-law relations, what we call the as-sihr. He says, وَأُمَّهَاتُ نِسَائِكُمْ, the mothers of your wives. That is to say, your mother-in-law is haram for you to marry forever. وَرَبَائِبِكُمْ, Raba'ib is the plural of a rabiba. This is your stepdaughter, meaning the daughter of your wife, who is not your biological daughter, of course. They are called rabiba, which is the feminine of rabib, because the stepfather is the Rabb of such a child. In other words, the Rabb looks after that particular thing he or she is the Rabb of. So the stepfather looks after the affairs of the stepchild. As for when he says fi hujurikum, hujur is the plural of hijr. It can also be pronounced hajar. It means linguistically the front part of the clothing, but in this context it means the one who is under your guardianship. Now this description is not a description intended in and of itself. This description is what they call qaid aghlabi, what most often happens to be the case. What most often happens is that the daughter of your wife lives with you and is under your guardianship. Okay, so what if she's not under your guardianship? What if she is grown up and perhaps is married, or perhaps is living away from you? She has her own place, for example. The rule still applies. There is no antithesis to this restriction, because this description, fi hujurikum, is qaydun aghlabi, what most often happens to be the case. But there's another restriction which is made, and this restriction is intended in and of itself, which is min nisaikum allati dakhaltum bihin, from your wives whom you have dakhaltum bihin, entered upon, basically means you have consummated marriage with them. So it means sexual intercourse. And this restriction is intended in and of itself because he goes on to explain it further. If you have not had sexual intercourse with these wives of yours, so you have not consummated the marriage, then there is no sin upon you. فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ. There is no sin upon you to marry these stepdaughters of yours. So in other words, if you marry a woman and you enter into the contract, this woman has a daughter. You change your mind and you want to marry this daughter instead rather than her mother. This is permissible for you as long as you have not consummated marriage with this wife of yours, who is the mother of the daughter. But if you divorce this wife before consummating marriage, then you are allowed to marry her daughter. Note that the same ruling does not apply to the mother of your wife. So in other words, if you marry a woman and you just enter into the marriage contract, but you have not yet consummated the marriage, just by the mere contract alone, you are never ever allowed to marry the mother of this wife of yours. So this rule with the mother is stricter, and the reason why is likely to be because if a man marries a woman and sees the daughter of this woman, the daughter of the woman may seem more attractive to him because she is younger, and he may want to marry her instead. So the Sharia allows for this flexibility, whereas this is not likely to be the case with the mother of your wife. You're not likely to want to marry the mother of your wife, as she is older and more likely to be less attractive to you. So with regards to the in-laws, he has spoken about the daughter of your wife and the mother of your wife. The previous ayah spoke about the wife of your father, and now he says وَحَلَائِلُ أَبْنَائِكُمْ, the wives of your sons. Now sulb is the plural of aslab. Sulb means backbone. So your sons from your backbones basically is an expression to say your biological sons. So if you have a biological son and he enters into a marriage contract with a particular woman, that woman is never allowed for you to marry by the mere contract, regardless of whether he consummates the marriage or not. However, min aslabikum, what does that not include? Well, many scholars say that does not include your sons from adoption. So that if you have a son whom you've adopted, then his wife, if he divorces her, is allowed for you to marry. And this is exactly what happened with Zayd ibn Haritha. Zayd ibn Haritha, who was married to Zaynab bint Jahsh, their marriage did not work out. He divorced her, and the Prophet married Zaynab bint Jahsh. So he married the former wife of his adopted son. Now the issue with this interpretation is that Islam abrogated adoption, so that you're not allowed to adopt anyone in the very first place. By adoption we mean you take this child as if he or she were your own biological child. That can never be the case. They can never inherit from you, for example. They can never be your mahram. So if adoption in the first place is not allowed in Al-Islam, then this would give rise to a problem with this interpretation. Because if adoption in the first place is not allowed, then do we really need to speak about the wives of your adopted sons when you're not even allowed to have an adopted son in the first place? What appears to be a more rational view is that you have two types of sons, biological son and a breastfeeding son. So your breastfeeding son would be that you're married to a wife with whom you have consummated marriage. This wife of yours produces milk in her breasts. This milk is produced because of your sexual intercourse with her. So you become the sahibul laban, the owner of the milk, because the milk is produced because of you. Now if this wife of yours breastfeeds a male child, who is of course not your biological male child, some next male child, then that male child becomes your breastfeeding son. If this breastfeeding son now grows up and marries a woman, then majority of the scholars say you are not allowed to marry this woman if this breastfeeding son of yours divorces her. This is the majority opinion. The minority opinion is you are allowed to marry such a woman, because the Quran says that your sons min aslabikum, from your loins. So this does not include your breastfeeding sons. In other words, you are allowed to marry those women whom your breastfeeding sons have divorced. This opinion does make sense, it is rational. However, just to be on the safe side, there is no problem in physically working with the majority opinion, which says you're not allowed to marry such women. And after all, it's not like you do not have a choice. Women are many. However, if someone were to work by the minority opinion, then can we say that such a person is a sinner and that this marriage is invalid? No. Then he goes on to say, and it is haram for you to combine between two sisters. So if there are two women, both of them are sisters, you're not allowed to be married to both of them at the same time. Even though a man can have up to 4 wives, as we discussed earlier, but from those 4 wives, 2 of them must not be sisters. And this does not make a difference whether these 2 sisters are blood related or breastfeeding related. They are haram to be combined in a marriage contract. You may marry one but not the other. And if you want to marry the other one, you have to divorce the first one. Okay, does this ruling have a rationale? The answer is yes, it does. Two wives are likely to compete with each other and are likely even to hate each other, as jealousy amongst co-wives is absolutely well known. But if we have two sisters being jealous of each other, then this leads to breaking of ties of kinship. And so obviously we have to avoid this. إِلَّا مَا قَدَ سَلَفَ, except for that which has preceded. This means to say that if a man has been married to two sisters, before the knowledge reached him, then he is not sinful. However, when the knowledge does reach him, he has to divorce one of them. إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ غَفُورًا رَحِيمًا. That has preceded. So reflecting on this ayah, we take from the ayah the 7 types of women who are haram for you to marry through the blood relation. These women are forever haram to be married. And we also take that there are certain women who are haram to be married through breastfeeding relations. The ayah mentions 2, but we know from studying the Sharia in general that these are the 7 same types of women as from nasab, as we mentioned before. And the ayah also teaches us that breastfeeding relations make marriage haram because they create the mahramiyya, a woman being mahram to you. This ayah mentions 3 types, and then the ayah also makes mention of certain types of women who are haram for you to marry through the in-law relations. 3 mentioned in this ayah, 1 mentioned in the previous ayah, 4 in total. Just to summarize, these are, talking from the man's point of view, number 1, the mother of your wife, by the mere marriage contract alone. Number 2, the daughter of your wife, with whom you have consummated marriage. Number 3, the wife of your father, through the marriage contract alone. And number 4, the wife of your son, through the marriage contract alone. These are 4 women haram by the route of in-law. And as we talk about these women haram to marry, we are of course speaking from the man's point of view. As for the woman's point of view, this is easy, you just reverse the perspective. And the same rule applies. Okay, here's a question. Your father is married to a woman. This woman is not your biological mother. That woman has a daughter. That daughter is not from your father. Are you allowed to marry that daughter? The answer is yes, because there's nothing in the ayah to say that such a woman is haram. Yes, you're not allowed to marry the wife of your father, but the ayah does not speak of the daughter of the wife of your father, nor the mother of the wife of your father. Similarly, your son is married to a woman. This woman has a daughter not from your son. Are you allowed to marry that daughter? The answer is yes, because there's nothing to say that such a woman is haram. Okay, what about this? You have an uncle. Be it a paternal or maternal uncle, makes no difference. That uncle of yours has a wife. That uncle of yours divorces said wife. Are you allowed to marry that woman now? The answer is yes, because there's nothing to say that such a woman is haram. So we say that all women are halal for you to marry. That's the default position, unless you have evidence otherwise. Note that this ayah speaks about the women haram for you to marry. So the antithesis would be that anyone else would be halal for you to marry. Another question. You are married to a woman. What is well known from the ayah is that you are not allowed to marry the mother of your wife. However, is your brother allowed to marry the mother of your wife? The answer is yes, because the mother of your wife is only haram for you because she is your in-law. The mother of your wife has nothing to do with your brother. So the hurma is directed to you, the husband, not to anyone else. Now here's another question. You have a wife, and your wife has not just a biological mother, but a breastfeeding mother. Are you allowed to marry this breastfeeding mother of your wife? Here the majority of the scholars say no, because the ayah says that you're not allowed to marry the mothers of your wives. The minority opinion is that you are allowed to marry such a woman, because the ayah says mothers of your wives, it does not say breastfeeding mothers of your wives. Because when Allah Jalla wa Ala talks about breastfeeding mothers, He would make that clear, as He does in the ayah, وَأُمَّهَاتُكُمُ اللَّاتِي أَرْضَعْنَكُمْ. أَرْضَعَ يُرْضِعُ means to breastfeed. As for if He just leaves it in the absolute sense, ummahat, mothers, then it would then mean biological mothers. This is a fiqhi difference of opinion, but the safer opinion would be to work practically in accordance with the majority of opinion and do not marry the breastfeeding mother of your wife. We also learn of the breastfeeding hurma. What the ayah does not tell us is how much breastfeeding makes haram. Is it just one suckling or what? Here we need the sunnah for sure. The sunnah teaches us that 5 sessions of breastfeeding is what makes the hurma. Yes, there is a difference of opinion on the matter, but the weightier opinion is 5 sucklings, as in 5 sessions of breastfeeding. Because firstly, we have the text, which is a narration from Aisha radiallahu anha in the Sahih, but also from a rational perspective, 5 meals, if you like, or 5 sessions of breastfeeding is sufficient enough to have an effect on the breastfeeding child. Anything less than that would not be sufficient enough to create the hurma. And when we say breastfeeding sessions, we mean sessions. So, for example, a baby might be breastfeeding, let's say, for 20 minutes. During those 20 minutes, he may take many sucks, but the whole session in total lasts for 20 minutes. So that would count as one breastfeeding. So we are talking about the sessions and not the number of sucks per se. Even though in this matter there is a difference of opinion, but what we have said appears to be the safer opinion. Because the asl, the default position is that the hurma is not created until we can be sure that it is created. Now we need to know the rules of the breastfeeding hurma. If you are the breastfeeding son of a woman, then her husband, who has consummated marriage with her, is your breastfeeding father. This breastfeeding father of yours, if he has sisters, his sisters are your breastfeeding aunts. Similarly, the sisters of your breastfeeding mother are also your breastfeeding aunts, and therefore haram for you in marriage. However, they are not haram for your brother, who has not breastfed from this same woman. So the breastfeeding hurma only applies to the breastfeeding son per se, or the breastfeeding daughter, as the case may be. Similarly, if you are the breastfeeding father of a male, then this male, if he marries and has a daughter, his daughter is like your breastfeeding granddaughter. And just like your biological granddaughter is haram for you to marry, so then is your breastfeeding granddaughter haram for you to marry. However, it is halal for you to marry the sister of your breastfeeding son, if this sister of his is not your breastfeeding daughter. Why is this? Because the relationship between you and the sister of your breastfeeding son is just like any other relationship. It is halal for you to marry her. Similarly, if you are a breastfeeding father of a breastfeeding son, the breastfeeding son of yours has a biological mother. It is halal for you to marry his biological mother, because the relationship between you and the biological mother of your breastfeeding son is like any other relationship. The default is that it is halal to marry. We also note that these rules apply to marriages. Now, fornication is not the same as marriage. So, for example, if a man fornicates with a woman, he is allowed to marry the mother of that woman. And we cannot make an analogy and say that just because you're not allowed to marry the mother of your wife, you are similarly not allowed to marry the mother of your fornicating partner. This analogy does not work, because the fornication and marriage are 2 different things entirely. We learn that the ayah teaches us you're not allowed to combine between 2 sisters in marriage, and we said this is in the absolute sense. It does not matter how these two sisters are related, whether they're full sisters or consanguine sisters or uterine sisters or breastfeeding sisters. As long as they're both sisters, you're not allowed to combine between them in marriage. Actually, the rule is broader than just sisters. You're not allowed to combine in marriage between two women who are closely related to each other. So a woman and her mother, a woman and her sister, a woman and her daughter, a woman and her paternal aunt or maternal aunt. These are close relationships. You're not allowed to combine between such two women. Okay, what about this? Are you allowed to combine between two women who are cousins to each other? The answer is yes. Why is this? Are cousins not closely related? Well, the answer is yes, cousins are closely related, but not closely enough for our purposes. And the way you tell is that you suppose that one of them was a male and the other is a female. You ask yourself, are they allowed to marry each other? If they are not allowed to marry each other, they are closely related. If they are not allowed to marry each other, they're not so closely related. So then we ask, is a man allowed to marry his cousin? The answer is yes, which means they are not so closely related. So in other words, two women who are cousins are not so closely related so as to make combining between them in marriage haram. In fact, we may say the same thing if you have two servant women. Obviously, you're not married to a servant woman, they are your servants. But if these two women happen to be sisters and you have sexual intercourse with one of the servant girls of yours, you're not allowed to have sexual intercourse with her sister, because this would be similar to combining between two sisters in marriage. The general rule about this is, if you're not allowed to have sexual intercourse with a woman in a marriage contract, then you are also not allowed to have sexual intercourse with that same woman if she is your servant girl. And the only exception to this general rule is a servant girl who is a mushrikah, because you are not, as a Muslim, allowed to marry a mushrikah. However, you are allowed to have sexual intercourse with a mushrikah if she is your servant girl. We also take that if anyone had entered into a haram nikah contract before the knowledge came to them, meaning before this ayah, then such a contract would not be deemed to be sinful. Of course, you have to annul it when the knowledge comes to you. However, what if you have children from that contract? Those children would be deemed to be legitimate children. So for example, they would be allowed to inherit from you as they are legitimate children. We also take the two names of Allah, Ghafoor and Rahim. We have met them before, along with their attributes befitting to Allah Jalla wa Ala. هذا والله أعلم.